That was a short section from my piece for organ and trumpet, The Wind to Troy. I've come to the Lutheran parish church of Peter and Paul, commonly called the Herder Church, partly to see the organ here, but also because the church was named after Johann Gottfried von Herder, who was invited to be general superintendent here by Goethe during the early years of the Weimar classical period. His statue stands proudly outside to this day. The church was established in the 13th century and rebuilt in its current Gothic style in the late 15th century. Inside, the church has a beautiful altar. The Cranach triptych at the centre was completed in the 16th century, about 25 years after Weimar converted to Lutheranism. It shows the redemption of humankind through faith in Christ. It's not known how much was painted by Cranach the Elder or Cranach the Younger, respectively. Martin Luther was a frequent visitor to Weimar in those days, and the Luther triptych here shows his picture as a monk, a nobleman in disguise, and a university professor. This is the north wing of the altar. I hope I'm not disturbing anybody here. Behind me are the representatives of the 16th century elector and his wife who, caught in the turmoil of religious wars, selected Weimar as a new regional capital and moved all the associated administrative functions of their government here. The elector also founded the nearby University of Jena. It's heartening to see the connections made between belief and learning. And indeed, one of the reasons I've come here, other than the organ, and other to recognise the achievement of Herder, is to consider how a multicultural learning environment, as exists in my school and many other schools all across Europe today, might handle absolute truth as represented by most religious doctrine. On the face of it, the accommodation of several absolute truths is a contradiction in terms. Here's the problem. If person 1 says that their truth is absolute, and that this truth reveals A but not B, but person 2 says that their truth is absolute and that the truth reveals B but not A, then there are the seeds of conflict. If this problem is something more than just a trick of language, then one possible solution might be to adopt a relativist standpoint. Person A is free to have their point of view and person B is free to have their point of view. Well, I've come here to the Herder Church because also it represents a certain approach to relativism, as I hope to show. Duchess Anna Amalia is buried somewhere in the church, although I'm not sure where, but I found Herder's tomb. He was a superintendent here from 1776 until his death in 1803, and now his final resting place is set in the floor right in the middle of the church. It's an ideal spot for listening to the organ. Coupled with the statue outside, there's no question that Herder is central to the modern identity of this church. Johann Gottfried von Herder was born in Prussia and studied at the University of Königsberg with Kant, although before the older figure wrote his celebrated Critiques, which was fine, as Herder was a free and perhaps unstructured thinker, and not at all attached to the cause of justification by reason. He was a fierce opponent of rationalism in general, and looked back to the vitality of the pre-rational past with warm nostalgia. He argued that the forces of dark in the past, including the authority of priestly power possessed in the Catholic Church, had been vehicles of goodness despite their darkness, whereas the illumination of the modern Enlightenment programme could never in itself bring satisfaction and resolve. Herder was to become a clergyman, but he would always remain a free thinker. He refused to be constrained by reason or fundamentalist dogma. During an early trip around Europe, he met with Goethe several times in Strasbourg before he moved to Weimar. Their meetings were lively and very influential on the younger man. Goethe was deeply impressed by Herder's ideas about the German struggle against French cultural domination and the need to find a strategy for their enfeebled nation to establish itself. Herder argued that Shakespeare had shown how poetry and literature could be a source of national pride and patriotism. He argued language could be used to emancipate the populace from the role of superfluous rabble into a unified classless people with a common language and ideals. Goethe agreed and was inspired to take up writing with renewed energy. I've taken a moment to come to the Herder room in Weimar City Castle Museum. It was commissioned by Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna and completed in 1840 with paintings by Bernard Neher. It's one of 4 similar rooms here in the castle, which acknowledges Herder's place at the centre of Weimar Classicism. Herder's ideas have had as significant an impact upon Western thought as those of Kant, even though his name is less well known today. This is probably because, while Kant's transcendental approach to the mind has acted as a challenge and starting point for many generations, Herder's historiography, his linguistics and hermeneutics, were passed on to others in successive generations piecemeal. He's the grandfather of disciplines, of modern linguistics and anthropological historiography in particular, rather than the sole representative of a position. And furthermore, he's the patriarch of what was to become the Athens of Germany. McCarthy called Herder's Ideen a manifesto of Weimar Classicism. It was a rallying cry. Humankind must realize its destiny. It must seamlessly connect individual aspirations with a universal humanitarianism, incorporating notions of tolerance, altruism, and respect. Indeed, it was Herder's ideas on the role of literature in this project that inspired Goethe's The Sufferings of Young Werther and the entire Sturm und Drang movement, and that brought Goethe to the attention of Duchess Anna Amalie in Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach. Immediately after Goethe was offered an administrative role in the Weimar court, he invited his friend to join him as a church superintendent. Here, the two men were able to further discuss Herder's views on the natural grounding of language. The older man argued that language was derived from secular origins rather than from a divine source, and that the meaning of concepts is established and grounded by everyday use, not in some kind of otherworldly metaphysical realm, such as that proposed by Plato. Furthermore, Herder rejected the dualist conception of language, whereby language and thought were considered to be autonomous. He conceived all the levels of mind as an integrated whole. Anticipating the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, whereby language structure is considered to determine modes of thought, Herder argued that mental concepts are defined in scope by language. A person could only think what he or she could also express in language. In this way, according to Forster, Herder made a fundamental contribution to the birth of modern linguistics. Herder's approach to language also enabled him to develop a theory of interpretation, a theory of hermeneutics. He argued that the interpretation of concepts and beliefs is not a fixed absolute, and furthermore, neither should it assume religious conventions. These things have changed over time according to cultural conditions. They develop over the course of history. Consequently, in seeking to interpret a historical text, including the Bible, Herder said it's important not only to take the text at face value and to avoid adding a personal slant, but also to consider the original context of the writing, including the intended genre. In common with others of his time, Herder assumed that the original meaning of a text is as much an objective matter as the topics addressed by natural science. However, he acknowledged that, given the rift that typically divides an interpreter's or a translator's thought from that of the writer, when it comes to the analysis and genuine understanding, nothing shall be taken for granted. If Herder's hermeneutic approach was to inspire Schleiermacher, who in turn passed the ideas on to the 20th century, then something similar happened as regards his approach to history. Herder argued that history should not be viewed as a linear development, as was normally the case in Enlightenment historiography. He said that the development of civilization and human ideas through time is a dialectic process integrating the states of being and becoming. It was oriented on progressive revelation and the realization of the divine in humankind. This is very much opposed to the universality and a priori constancy of mind outlined in Kant's transcendental idealism, but I should add Herder's approach to making claims is very different to that of Kant. Herder opposed the systemization of ideas employed by writers such as Spinoza and Wolff. He wouldn't have liked the work of Hegel either, despite his influence on the historiography of the younger man.
Nevertheless, despite his anti-theoretical approach, his theory of history presented a powerful new idea to others of his time. The idea that different cultures, and in particular different historical eras, hold radically different paradigms of the world that in turn define their beliefs, the concepts implied by their language, their ethics, and even their perception of the world.
This idea of cultural relativism, of assigning a unique intrinsic value to each epoch in cultural history with its own particular contribution to the evolution of humankind, had an enormous impact on other Weimar and Jena writers, particularly Hegel and later on Nietzsche, who also lived in Weimar and who I'll look at later.
Historical periods are defined by their psychology and the interpretations that people make of the world, rather than by their great historical figures or events. In fact, Herder resented the attention placed upon military leaders in history, especially those highly regarded for their totalitarian politics and killing credentials. Actually, Herder was not only a patriotic Republican, he was one of the very few in Weimar who spoke positively about the French Revolution. He was committed to the principles of egalitarianism, as seen in his approach to viewing das Volk as being best served by an equal and classless society, and in his interest in folklore and Volkslieder.
It was Herder who brought to Weimar the idea of applying the notions of harmony and reconciliation to society as a whole. For instance, he argued that Jewish people should be given full rights and compensated for past injustices. He opposed the absolutist approach to politics and ethics common in the past, and that he also deemed to be prevalent in Enlightenment values. He argued that ethics, like aesthetics, is intuitive and more grounded in subjective sentiment than objective reason. In terms of literature, Herder said he perceived poetry and the genre of novel writing as having a particularly potent role as regards moral norms, and capable of exerting a strong moral influence on intuitions and on human society as a whole. Herder also had strong opinions about the nature of mind. He was perhaps more sympathetic with the empiricism of David Hume than the rationalism of locals Leibniz and Wolff. Indeed, he had a distrustful attitude towards all metaphysics, including Cartesian dualism, which he believed distracted society from empirical integrity and thereafter moral responsibility. He was sceptical about attempts to rationalize a transcending of experience, like Kant, which he argued create only the illusion of meaning. He posited that many theories pertaining to the mind are so far-fetched as to be dangerous.
His approach was more naturalistic, even though he felt alienated from the explanations of his time of nature as a soulless machine. He yearned for the immediacy of nature with its simplicity and directness above the artificial luxury and idleness of urban society. He aspired to fuse the mind with the raw naturism of nature. Indeed, as Goya said, Herder does more than almost anyone else in 18th century Germany to minimize separation between mind and body.
Herder argued for erasing the division between the mental and the physical by linking mental states with behaviour and physiological conditions. Most interestingly, he claimed that mind and body are a unity while at the same time avoiding a reduction of sensation to cognition. As I said before, he grounded his claim not in the a priori but in the a posteriori, which in turn supported his other arguments that meaning is derived from the social context and that there's an ethical as well as an aesthetic dimension to sensation.
Admittedly, Herder's approach to aesthetic theory was not as influential as his impact in other areas, even though he applied his other theories here, for instance to conclude that impressions of beauty are culturally defined. I suspect that his lack of influence in aesthetic theory might be attributable to the fact that for many years he was reluctant to acknowledge the cogency of the arts, in particular the ability of art to express ideas. As always, his approach was firmly non-cognitivist. He argued the writing and reading of poetry applies the imagination to the vigour of real life and is thus an endeavour infused with a mighty soul. It expresses truth. But on the other hand, music elicits merely sensory pleasure and is constrained by being comprised of a mere succession of objects in time. People should therefore look to literature and not the performing and visual arts to advance their moral lives and their sense of virtue.
However, later, after his move to Weimar and his increased interest in classical themes, including the use of allegory in the literature and sculpture of ancient Greece, he relaxed his approach. He conceded that art can express more than sensitivities and even thoughts. He was no longer dogmatic about the direct association of thought with linguistics and relented to a compromise whereby thoughts expressed by allegory or other symbolic representations in art can convey meaning by way of association with linguistic expression. Herder acknowledged that sculpture in particular is able to express ideas equivalent to those of poetry, even though they need to be reduced to a linguistic semantic. Finally, in his Letters for the Advancement of Humanity, written in 1781 after his move to Weimar, Herder extended the same solution to music. This is the organ. It was renovated in 1964 after being destroyed during a wartime bombing raid that brought down the church roof. It has a long history. Bach used the church and its organ for the baptism of his own children, including C.P.E. Bach. Mendelssohn and Liszt also played here, which I'm sure would have been beautiful occasions. No doubt Herder would have been pleased to find the ideal of beauty concerned not with either external, natural or artificial beauty, but with the inner spiritual beauty. Which brings me back to religion and the question I asked earlier. Given that in my school we want to work with parents as partners, how do we reconcile parents teaching children, for instance, that Christ's birth was immaculate, or some other doctrinal metaphysical truth, when the biology program says such a thing is impossible? How do we reconcile value systems?
We can simply assert our own values, a belief in inquiry-based learning and principled action, and position these values as a central space around which those of different faiths can find common ground, but that in itself doesn't address the underlying issues associated with the placement of absolutism in a context beyond that absolutism, whereby the foundations of that absolute don't allow for a context beyond its fundamentalist absolutism.
It's interesting that Pope Francis, representing the Catholic Church, spoke of doubt as being an integral component of faith. And I'm sure Herder would have been very sympathetic to the need to find resolve in the same way too. Doubt enables an individual to deal with paradox and contradictions, of which there are many in human conventions. And one of the greatest strengths of mature religion might be said to be a commitment to discourse and the notion of fallibilism.
Except any criteria I might use for representing maturity are also going to be historical entities and relative to the contingent cultural context, which will make fallibilism and doubt historical phenomena too.
In the case of Herder, always his argument was for reconciliation and unity, appealing for the concord of community, and for the individual, the unification of body, mind and spirit. There was no dogmatism. His approach was a progressive one, as can be seen in his insistence upon allegorical rather than literal interpretations of the Bible.
The absolutism of faith is a metaphysical construct, and if I'm going to have any hope of answering my question, I'm going to need to look further at matters of ontology, as the idealists of the Weimar classical era did. Herder recognised this too, and most probably it was this recognition that caused his interest in the pantheism of Baruch Spinoza. The late 17th century Dutch-Portuguese thinker had rejected Cartesian dualism and suggested that God and nature should be taken to be the same thing, even if expressed differently. Herder made a number of accommodating changes, given that Spinoza had been excommunicated by Jewish religious authorities, and his work had later been banned by the Catholic Church too. Herder characterized the unity of Spinozan monism not as a material substance, but as a primal force that can be conceived as either universal mind or universal spirit. And rather than conceiving nature in a mechanistic fashion, he described nature as living and organic, a notion that was picked up by Goethe.
To this day, with Herder's statue outside, this church offers a more compromising and conciliatory approach to doctrine. It was these walls that offered a free space for dissenters during the era of Stasi secret police and the repressive politics of the German Democratic Republic. And it's this church that stages many concerts today, both religious and secular, during the city's many music festivals. I've raised many questions in this episode, which I'll return to later. But for now, I'd like to play another section from my piece, The Winds to Troy, for trumpet and organ.
Thank you.